All right, today we're going to start talking about the philosophy of David Hume. We're going to be looking at someone who considers himself an empiricist and so belongs on a certain part of our chart, believes that all knowledge comes from experience, but he also questions our ability to actually know something about the world as it is. That is to say, he's really on the idealist side of thinking that everything that we can know anything about is in some sense an idea, a construction of the mind. Now, are there actual material substances independent of the mind? Is there, in other words, something like what the realist describes as a thing in itself, something that exists totally independently of mind, really out there? He ends up saying, actually, I don't even understand the question. So, in a certain sense, the way I've positioned him in this course is as a skeptic. That's a little bit misleading in a way, because he doesn't really affirm the truth of idealism. That would be to presuppose that this question of whether the objects are mind-dependent or independent is actually a real question. He finds it an unintelligible question. He basically says the things I can know about are constructions of the mind. They're really ideas and combinations of ideas. Are there other things? I don't even know what you mean. And so in that respect, he's somebody who less recognizes the existence of the line and declares himself on one side of it, than someone who says, I don't even understand how to draw that line. I find the existence of the line, in some sense, unintelligible. Well, Hume was born in 1711, died in 1776, the year of the American Revolution. He was part of, and in fact, a main figure in the Scottish Enlightenment, along with, for example, Adam Smith. So Hume was himself spending most of his life in Edinburgh. He was never, however, really appointed to the university in the way that he desired, partly because it was suspected that he was an atheist. And we've already looked at some of his arguments in the Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, something published after his death. His main work of philosophy is this, the Treatise of Human Nature. That's my own well-loved copy that you're looking at there. And it's something that he wrote when he was only 23 years old. It's rather remarkable that at 23 he wrote one of the great texts of Western philosophy. He, however, was very disappointed in it. He said it fell stillborn from the press because nobody seemed to pay it any attention. So he wrote a much shorter work, The Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, that was kind of like a summary of the treatise, although it did approach certain questions somewhat differently. And in that work, he sounds many of the same themes, but in a much shorter version, something much easier for people to understand. It helped to popularize his ideas. I want to go back to something we looked at a while ago, something foundational not only to Hume's empiricism, but to empiricism in general, the distinction between simple and complex ideas. And related to that, a distinction between ideas and impressions. Hume says that impressions are the things that are something like perceptions. Okay, I get impressions from the outside world through my senses, and then I form ideas on the basis of those impressions. Well, simple ideas come from simple impressions. So both at the level of the perceptions and at the level of ideas, I've got this distinction between the simple things that really can't be broken down any further, and then the complex things that have the simple things as parts. Well, he has a bold thesis. The simple ideas are ones that represent the content of our simple impressions exactly. So those are ideas that directly reflect what we're experiencing. However, we move to more complex ideas, and then we can put things together in all sorts of ways, some of which we experience and some of which we don't. Hume says all our simple ideas in their first appearance are derived from simple impressions, which are correspondent to them and which they exactly represent. So my idea of green is just a direct reflection of my impression of green. My idea of, well, what exactly are these simples? He acts as if color terms are simple, but actually they're almost certainly not simple. And in fact, he himself gives an idea. I don't mean in his technical sense, but he gives you an admission, really, that it's not always true. And the right way, I think, to think about this would be to say color ideas are not really simple ideas. He says, suppose you've experienced a certain shade of blue, and then you experience another shade of blue that's fairly closely related to it. You've never seen anything in between. Could you nevertheless form an idea of a color that is halfway in between those two shades of blue? And he ends up concluding, I think you could, even though you haven't experienced it He says, well, so maybe this isn't always true. It's usually true. That's good enough for an empiricist. That does reflect something important about his method. He's viewing himself as the first psychologist, and what's more or less true is good enough for him. But actually, an obvious response would be our color ideas are not simple ideas. And indeed, if you've ever had to represent colors on a web page, for example, you know it takes a number of different dimensions. You've got to specify hue, you've got to specify darkness or lightness. There are different dimensions that you have to specify in order to really pin that color down. So he really should have said, I guess color ideas aren't simple. But the real question then is, what are these symbols? Well, he never really tells us. There is, however, a method hidden in this distinction, or this pair of distinctions between the simple and complex and ideas and impressions. There's a method that he describes as the empiricist method. In order to understand an idea, you've got to analyze complex ideas into their simple components, into the simple ideas that make them up. And then you see what experiences actually underlie those simple ideas. So you find the origins of those simple ideas in experience. And that gives you the content of this complex idea. Break the complex idea into the simple ideas, trace to the simple impressions and experience. That tells you what the real content of the idea is. Now, sometimes, he thinks, you're actually led into nothingness when you do this. You find out there is no content to the idea, that it's all nonsense, that you don't actually understand anything in talking about those ideas. And look, he says, actually, I think that often happens in philosophy. So I'm tempted to ask here, are there any terms you think that actually have no content? Any ideas that have no content? They don't really mean anything to the final analysis. I'm a little afraid you'll say, yeah, every term you've taught us throughout this entire semester. And Hume would actually have a lot of sympathy with that. He'd say, yeah, I think a lot of philosophical ideas really in the end are nonsense. We'll see some examples. One of them is the idea of substance. So he's going to think that a lot of what gets said in philosophy is pure garbage, really in the end has no content. But it's not just philosophy. Lots of things are like this, okay? We talk a lot of nonsense. So can you think of any things you would consider nonsense? You would say, yeah, people talk about this, but I think that's just complete garbage. It has no actual content. Yes?
Small talk.
Small talk. Well, some small talk has content. If I say, hey, do you think it's going to rain today? I mean, it's easy. You know, there's no complex idea there that's hard to trace back to experience. Rain? What if you said, rain? That's a bunch of nonsense. No such thing as rain. I wouldn't even know how to recognize rain. I mean, so those, I mean, a lot of small talk is like that. Now, there might be small talk, however, that really doesn't have much of any content. So what would be an example of that? Actually, I mean, one example might be, hey, how you doing? Fine. Actually, I said that in a Pittsburgh accent. How you doing? I always talk to my cats as if they're from Pittsburgh. I found, I sort of fall back into my Pittsburgh accent. So I walk in the door and speak to my cats and say, how you doing? And that's a very Pittsburgh thing. But anyway, you know, that sort of exchange, how you doing? Fine. It's like, notice people say fine no matter what. And if somebody stops and says, well, actually, my knee has been sore, and I've got this exam next week, and so on. Unless they're a close friend, you're thinking, oh, you're supposed to say fine, right? Leave me alone. And so that sort of small talk exchange might be one where, in the end, there's no content, right? You're supposed to say fine no matter what, so it has no actual content. Karl Popper thought that a lot of terms from Freudian psychological theory were like this. They really had no content and experience. So you say, oh, I'm experiencing a displacement of the ego. And Popper just says, you know, that's nonsense. It doesn't make any sense. Or actually, he thought the same of a lot of Marxist terminology. Oh, wait, I see this as a manifestation of the ideology of the bourgeoisie. And Popper goes, okay, there are no criteria by which you determine what that is. Turns out anything can be that in Marxist theory. So he claims that much Marxism, much Freudianism, lots of other isms actually are filled with terms that are meaningless. Now, however you think about that, Hume is saying there's a problem here because impressions are strong, okay? There is a sense in which experience is something presented to you and it has a real force to it. The idea of green is something that has a real force. However, the idea of, I don't know, the bourgeoisie or of the id or of, I don't know, some other kind of abstract term may be sort of hard to grasp. It might be very hard, maybe impossible in the end to really trace it to experience. And he says, what makes us tricked by this is that ideas are weak. And so it's not at all unclear to us whether we're experiencing something green or not. I mean, look at my shirt. Are you experiencing something green in looking at my shirt? No. And you have no trouble telling that, right? It's not like, well, I don't know, what do you mean by green? And blah, blah, blah. No, it's very clear, right? No, but if we talk about ideas, it's easy to get confused. And so he says all ideas, and especially abstract ones, are naturally faint and obscure. The mind has but a slender hold of them. They're apt to be confounded with other resembling ideas, and when we've often employed any term, though without a distinct meaning, we're apt to imagine it has a determinate idea next to it. So because they're rather vague, they're rather weak in their impressions, it's easy to get confused about whether an idea really has any content or not. The content isn't right there on its sleeve the way it is with an impression. Well, as I've already mentioned, impressions aren't like that. It's very easy to tell when you're seeing green, when you're seeing red, and so forth. So, he says, here's my method. Here's what I want you to do. When you hear an idea and you're thinking, wait, I don't know if this makes any sense or not, when we entertain any suspicion that a philosophical term is employed without any meaning or idea, as is but too frequent, we need but inquire from what impression is that supposed idea derived. And if it be impossible to assign any, this will serve to confirm our suspicion. By bringing ideas into so clear a light, we may reasonably hope to remove all dispute which may arise concerning their nature and reality. So Hume says, a lot of times you hear ideas, and you're thinking, wait, I don't know if this person's really saying anything that makes any sense or not. I'm not sure what the content of this is, if it has any content at all. And so Hume's saying, think about what it really means for experience. What is its content in terms of experience? Could you say, when, aha, I'm now in a situation where that applies. I'm not in a situation where that applies. If you can clearly say that, then good, that term has real meaning. But if not, you might think the term has no real meaning. I'll tell you a little story about something like this. Some years ago, about 20 years ago, the English department here had a job candidate come and give a talk, as job candidates tend to do. I never did that, but anyway, it's commonly done, okay, that people get invited to campus and give a talk. Anyway, this talk was all about hegemony. And it was hegemony this, hegemony that, blah, 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 blah. So in the end, somebody who was, I think, an undergraduate student actually asked, what is hegemony? And the person had no idea what to say. They were like, well, it's... Anyway, it was just like in one of the Socratic dialogues, right? Where somebody's talking about virtue and Socrates says, what is virtue? And usually they come up with something to say. But this person was totally stumped. He was like, my talk was just about this subject. And when you now say, what is it? What I don't understand the term, they couldn't give a definition. Not just a definition that would satisfy Socrates. I mean, it's not as if this undergraduate were a philosophy major could have then proceeded to imitate Socrates, as you all somehow could. They just asked a simple question. I don't know what this word means. What is hegemony? And the person couldn't explain. Now, Hume would say, now, here's one way of looking at it. All right, the person really is using a term that they don't understand the meaning. But another way of looking at it is to say, well, can anybody say what it is? If not, then there's a suspicion that this is nonsense, that it has no real content at all. So that's the kind of question we're to ask. Now, the fact that one person doesn't understand the term is no reason to dismiss it. If somebody says, gosh, they were talking about, partial integration. I don't know what that means. And somebody says, oh, well, a partial integral in calculus is, but suppose somebody doesn't know enough calculus to answer the question. They say, oh, I don't know. Or somebody says, what's a differential equation? And the person says, I don't know. That doesn't mean there's no content to the idea of a differential equation or to a partial integral or something. It's a question of whether somebody can do it. That might not have any content for that person if they can't tell you. But the question is really, does anybody understand this? And his suspicion is that often the answer is no. Now let's go back to the basic idea of empiricism. We've said that the dividing line between the empiricist and the rationalist concerns synthetic a priori judgments. The question of whether you could know something that is really about the world as opposed to language, that is independent of experience. That's the a priori part. So the basic question is, are there synthetic a priori judgments? Can I know something about the world on the basis of rational reflection or something else than experience? And the rationalist says, yes, we can. There are synthetic a priori truths. The empiricist says, no, there's no such thing. Every truth about the world is either analytic and a priori, something that we know just on the basis of logic and definitions, something like all bachelors are bachelors or all bachelors are unmarried, or it's something that is synthetic and a posteriori, like there are people in this room. And there's nothing else. There are no deep truths about the world you can understand just through philosophical reflection. Well, that means there are really only two kinds of knowledge. There is knowledge of abstraction that stems from logic and definitions of terms. And so under that heading go logic, go mathematics, go a variety of things that result from definitions of terms in ordinary language. And then the other category is natural science, empirical study of the world, where that's understood broadly to include history and sociology and all sorts of things that are going to have to do with real observations of the world. There's nothing else. So Hume says, and this is one of my favorite passages from Hume, one of everybody's favorite passages in Hume, whether you like his position or not. When we run over libraries persuaded of these principles, what havoc must we make? If we take in our hand any volume of divinity or school metaphysics, for instance, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact or existence? No. Commit it then to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion. Now, he's really saying, and sometimes, I mean, it's strange to have a philosopher calling for a book burning. He's doing it only metaphorically, I think. But really, the idea is this. There are two legitimate ways of knowing something about the world. Through abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number, we get that in logic, we get that in mathematics. And then there's empirical science, the actual study of the world, through history, through psychology, through physics, through biology, etc. Those are the only ways of knowing things about the world. And so what does he say, suspecting? He mentions divinity or school metaphysics. What he means is really a tradition coming out of Aristotle and going through such figures as Augustine, well, especially Aquinas and their followers. He's saying, in other words, all that talk about substances and qualities and relations and properties and, gosh, what else comes up in Aristotelian metaphysics? Essences? All that nonsense. He's saying, throw it away. Take Aristotle. Throw him in the trash. Useless, okay? Meaningless. It's not empirical observation concerning matter of fact and existence. It's not abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number. Commit it to the flames. Now, that's a pretty extreme position. Suppose someone were to say, Hume, your book that fell stillborn from the press, a treatise of human nature, which category does it fit in? Does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? Well, no, there's no math about it. Any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? If not, we've got to commit it to the flames. So, actually, this passage appears in the inquiry, but the same question applies to it, the short sort of version. So, how could Hume respond? What is Hume doing here?
Yeah, maybe fall under experimental reasoning. He's thinking about, he's like making an evaluation of what the world is like, maybe.
Good, exactly. Hume's response would be, I am engaging in experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence. Hume thinks of himself as being the Newton of the mind. He actually uses that term at one point. He thinks of himself as the first psychologist, the first person who's actually giving you a theory of the mind. And so he's saying, come on, I'm not doing that kind of Aristotelian metaphysics where I'm talking about substances and properties and essences and all of that. No, I am instead telling you that the mind operates according to certain principles. I've got an empirical theory of the mind. And so I'm doing psychology here. I'm really saying, here are the kinds of ways in which people obtain knowledge. Okay, I'm giving you a psychological theory of that. One way is to reason about concepts and their relations to one another. And when I do that, I'm engaged in abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number, if I'm doing anything meaningful at all. But then, I also examine the world and gather up information from experience and generalize on the basis of experience. That's a legitimate thing to do, and that's what I'm doing now. Okay, I am doing this on the basis of my observations of people's mental operations. So exactly, that's what he would think. Some people think he can't answer this question, and that this is actually devastating for his position. But he wouldn't agree at all. He would say, I'm an empirical psychologist. This isn't some abstract philosophy, divinity, or school metaphysics. This is psychology. This is something that is based on reflection of people's actual experience with impressions, with ideas, with theories, with concepts, and I'm just telling you my own empirical theory about how the mind operates. Now, I want to go back to a couple of arguments we dealt with quickly for rationalism, because Hume has an interesting response to them, and not at all the response you might expect. Here was what Leibniz said in favor of a rationalist position, saying there has to be an a priori element to our knowledge. All experience is particular. But wait a minute, it looks like we actually have some universal knowledge. If I say, for example, force is equal to mass times acceleration in physics, I mean in every place, in every time, every mass is such that, the force is equal to the mass times the acceleration. That's really a universal claim about masses and forces and acceleration that is meant to apply to all times and all places and all objects. And the same thing with necessity. All of our experience is contingent, but I maintain that law, force is mass times acceleration, is really a law. It's really necessary. It's not just a contingent observation. Like, usually it turns out the force and mass and acceleration are related in this way. No, I'm saying it has to be that way. It has a law-like force to it. I'm not saying that if I release the keys, for example, to go to gravitation as an example, that odds are it's going to fall. Usually, generally this happens. No, I'm saying it has to fall. Once I let it go and there's no other force on it, it has to fall. It's not like it might fall or might not, usually does, etc. So, Leibniz would say, we can't get just from experience to universal laws or to necessary laws of nature. There has to be some a priori element, but it can't just be abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number. It's really about the world. We have to have an underlying principle about the uniformity of nature, about the necessity of things happening in the future the way they've happened in the past, or something that tells us there really is a universal necessity to these claims. Well, now Hume gives a different answer, because here there really is a challenge. How does the empiricist explain the law-like character of some of our knowledge? How does the empiricist explain the universality of some of our knowledge? Well, here is Hume's answer. He says we move from the particular to the universal through induction. That is to say, we see certain things happening in nature, we infer that they always happen in that way. But now, that's only part of the answer. In fact, it's much more puzzling than that. Because what justifies that move? I say, yes, I release the keys, they fall. I release the keys, they fall. Okay, we've seen this happen a bunch of times now. And I say, okay, I maintain that always when I let them go, they're going to fall, and that is a law of nature, or it follows from a law of nature. It really has a law-like character. They've got to fall. Well, what justifies that move? Hume says it can't be logic, because after all, it doesn't follow strictly of necessity. Could you imagine my letting this go and it not falling? Is that even a conceivable state of affairs? You might be like Fazzini. Let it go and it not fall? Inconceivable! Okay, but no, actually you can conceive of it, right? You can imagine that happening. And so there's no logical contradiction in that idea. It can't follow from logic. Now the rationalists will say, yeah, I didn't mean logic. There's some innate idea, there's some innate principle. But Hume says, actually nothing justifies. Something happens once. Do you infer, oh, it always happens that way and it has to happen that way, it's a law of nature? No. But wait, why does seeing it more times suddenly justify that conclusion? It doesn't make any sense. So let's talk about some inductive inferences. Here's one. All observed ravens have been black. Therefore, all ravens are black. When I've eaten bread, I've found it nourishing. So, bread is nourishing. Or, when the sun sets, it rises the next morning. So, the sun always rises the next morning. Now, he says, I don't dispute the fact that we reason this way. This is actually how we get our universal knowledge. And when this seems to be invariant in certain ways, we tend to think it's also law-like. But here's the thing. The question is really, what is that based on? Why do we do it? How do we justify the claim that we do? Or how do we justify doing it, I should say? He says it can't have an a priori justification. The next raven could be white. The next piece of bread you eat might actually not be nourishing. It could be poison. There might be a time when the sun goes nova and actually it doesn't rise the next morning. And so we can't say it's an a priori thing. It's actually kind of contingent. But also, it's not a posteriori, because that would appeal to experience, and that's just what's an issue. So suppose you say, wait, I want to know how you justify the claim that because all the ravens you've seen have been black, all ravens are black. You say, well, all the ones I've seen are. That's no justification, right? That's just repeating the premise. I say, yeah, I know, all the ones you've seen are, but you now claim that that's evidence that they all are. I want to know what justifies you going from some, the ones I've observed, to all. And you say, well, you know, that kind of inductive reasoning, I've done that in the past and it's worked out pretty well. And Hume says, you mean in the past, the observed cases of inductive reasoning have worked out okay, so it'll always work out okay? That's just the move that we're talking about, right? So even if you're right that it's always worked out okay, and actually I bet it's not, I bet sometimes you've had generalizations and then you get surprised by something that's an exception to the rule, but even if it were true, we'd say the fact that it's always worked out in the past, so it's always going to work out. I've always experienced inductive reasoning being successful, so it will always be successful. That's just one more example of inductive reasoning. And so any appeal to that would be circular. So, really, you might call this Hume's circle, the idea that there can't be any justification based on experience for our inductive reasoning based on experience. He says, we've said that all arguments concerning existence are founded on the relation of cause and effect, that our knowledge of that relation is derived entirely from experience, and that all our experimental conclusions proceed upon the supposition that the future will be conformable to the past. And so it looks like, wait, yes, how do we justify that? Well, to say the future is always always resemble the past up to now is no help. To endeavor the proof of this last supposition, that is to say that the future will resemble the past, by probable arguments or arguments regarding existence, must be evidently going in a circle, and taking that for granted, which is the very point in question. Why should I think the future will resemble the past? Well, it has up to now, is basically the answer, and Hume says that's obviously circular. That can't do us any good at all. Now, here's the question. I've called this Hume's tangent, but that's kind of a joke. Here's what is disturbing. He says, after the constant conjunction of two objects, like heat and flame, for instance, or weight and solidity, we're determined by custom alone to expect the one from the appearance of the other. The hypothesis seems the only one which explains the difficulty, why we draw from 1,000 instances an inference we're not able to draw from one instance that's no different from any of them. So, here is what is bothering him. He says, look, when I'm doing a priori reasoning, I can infer something about all circles from one circle using geometry. But nobody who sees something move could infer that it's always going to move that way, right? You see something fall for the very first time. Go back if you can. Imagine yourself as a baby, right? You've never seen anything fall. Maybe you've just emerged from your mother's womb, and you're just there taking your first breaths. You're like, ah! Okay? And the doctor turns and knocks something off the table. And for the first time, you see an object fall. Do you think, oh, the law of gravity. I bet it's always going to fall like that. Whenever something is released or dropped off a table, it's going to fall. No, of course you don't. There's no way to infer that from one instance. But somehow, we do infer it from a lot of instances. And he says, that tells us this isn't reasoning. If it were reasoning, as it would be in geometry, then even one instance should be enough. Instead, it is custom. It is really habit. It is something that is non-rational in us that's leading this to happen. So here's the contrast he has in mind. Think about this argument. This one flame is hot, so all flames are hot. That seems terrible. But how about this flame is hot, that flame is hot, that flame is hot, and so on? So all flames are hot. That strikes us as acceptable. But logically, it really doesn't seem to have much impact. It looks like we're just sort of repeating the same basic point of the premise. Especially when you think, my conclusion is supposed to apply to infinitely many flames, really. I mean, infinitely many possible flames, whereas my premises are actually just finite and contingent. It seems like this huge leap. So, here is Hume's rather skeptical solution to this puzzle. He says there is actually just no rational justification whatever for inductive inference. We see things once, we don't infer they're always going to be that way, but if we see them again and again, we do. The inference, however, is not based on logic. It is not based on any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence. It is something that is purely a tendency in human nature. Hence, A Treatise of Human Nature is the title of his work. He really says it's just the way we are. It's not that we have a reason, it's not that we have any rational justification, we just do it. Now, the same thing is true with causal inferences in general. We make causal inferences all the time, from cause to effect. For example, I say, I'm going to drop these keys again. Okay? There's going to be a cause, I'm going to release them. What's the effect going to be? They're going to fall. And so you say, okay, I can draw that inference. There's going to be that cause, they're going to fall. You were right. Or the effect, okay? What would an example of this be? You are acquainted with the effect, you infer something about the cause. Yeah?
Where there's smoke and fire.
Okay, where there's smoke, there's fire. You see smoke, you think there must be fire. You observe the effect, you think there's got to be a cause. Now, what justifies these principles of reasoning? Well, he says it's the same problem. Is it a priori? No, we can imagine it being otherwise. We can imagine finding smoke but no fire. We can imagine that I release this and it doesn't fall. We could imagine finding it on the ground and it didn't actually get there by falling. And it's also not a posteriori. But in this case, he says, it's for a different reason. We don't experience the causal link. We experience one thing and then another. We never see the connection. So you experience my releasing it and it falling. But do you see what connects them? Do you see the gravity? Do you see I let it go and then it falls, and do you see what happens in between? No. Nobody sees what happens in between. You can't see what happens in between. There's the cause, the effect, but you don't see the connection between them. So he says, when we look about us toward external objects and consider the operations of causes, we're never able in a single instance to discover any power or necessary connection. Here he's thinking of Locke, who defines causation in terms of powers or necessary connections. And he's saying, Locke, you're supposed to be an empiricist. Where's my experience of necessity? Where's my experience of power? I don't have experience of those things. I just have experience of the causes and the effects, but never the link between them. Any quality which binds the effect to the cause and renders the one an infallible consequence of the other. I never have any acquaintance with anything like that. It says all I experience is constant conjunction. I observe that one thing does follow another. The impulse of one billiard ball is attended with motion in the second. That's the whole that appears to the outward senses. This ball moves. I observe that one move. Do I see what happens in that moment where they touch? Do I see the little of causation? No. I just see one motion and the next motion. I don't see the link between them. So he says, on the whole, there appears not throughout all nature any one instance of connection, which is conceivable by us. All events seem entirely loose and separate. One event follows another. We can never observe any tie between them. They seem conjoined but never connected. And so, actually, somebody once said this, put a Humean view of the universe in a very nice way. Life is just one damn thing after another. Okay, we just see this, we see that. We start drawing connections between them, and we think one is the cause of the next, but we never observe that causal connection. And we don't have any rational justification for that. It's just the way we're built that we tend to do them. Here's a little joke. Don't give me that constant conjunction doesn't imply causal connection, Oakham. It's yours. Anyway, so here's the general point. From one instance, we can't infer anything. From repeated instances, we do infer a causal link, but nothing in the world changes as a result of that. We don't experience the link. So what changes? Our feeling of expectation. Let's say we see light for the first time. The baby sees light, and now you press pause on reality, and you say, now baby, what's going to happen? Does the baby know thunder? No. Okay? But then the baby hears thunder. Like, whoa. Ah. From that, gosh, doubly bad, right? Bright light, loud noise. Damn. Two things sucked there. But then the baby experiences this again and again and starts thinking there's some connection between the lightning and the thunder. What changes? The baby forms a feeling of expectation. The baby starts thinking, wait a minute, it's going to happen again. And is it rational? Is it a matter of logic? Is the baby doing natural science? No, it's just that the baby starts forming feelings of expectation. So, that is really the origin, he says, an experience of our idea of causation. It is not out there in the world, it is inside us. It is our feeling of expectation that changes. So we've got a constant conjunction of events. We get this feeling of expectation as a result of that. It is an internal impression. I hold this up above, and you're starting to anticipate, right? You're like a dog wagging its tail, thinking, it's going to fall, it's going to fall, it's going to fall. Yeah. Wow, that really fell. You get that feeling of expectation, anticipation. And that's where you get the idea of causation. That's where you get the idea of necessity. You never directly experience the necessity or the causal link. You just get a feeling of expectation. That's the thing and experience that underlies those ideas. Now that's sort of surprising, right? Because you thought necessity, you thought causation was out there in the world. But it turns out the actual content of the idea comes from something in you. The source is within. So, Hume concludes necessity, causation, they're not out there in the world. Those ideas come from something in us. And it's not even from reason in us. It's just from something about the way we're built. He calls it custom or habit. That implies we can change it the way we can change customs or change habits. But actually, I think in that respect, it's misleading language. He really means there is something in us, non-rational, something of the heart, as opposed to the head, really, that leads to this feeling and leads us to draw these conclusions. So he says necessity exists in the mind, not in objects. And the same thing is true of causation. Causation is something being supplied by the mind. It is not out there in the world. We project necessities. We project law-likeness. We project causation onto the world. It's not to be found there itself. So he says, it's a common observation. Oh, question? Yeah.
So I was just going to ask if there's something that we don't know, like the actual connection between them, but then we discover it later, what would you think about that? Like if we didn't know some mathematical thing that always happened and we just observed that it happened every single time and then we discovered why precisely it happens, what would that be?
Ah, well, okay, yeah, I mean, this might be something that happens quite quickly, but it might be something that happens over time. And actually, your question... Yes, your question should disturb us, because suppose we hear that noise, and we think someone's telephone rang, okay? It takes us a while, maybe, to figure that out. Now, in this case, it's not something that takes scientific inquiry, but it might take some experience, realizing, oh, that sound is distinctively linked with that certain thing. But let's think about a more scientific case, where we really have to investigate the cause. Let's say some people come down with some ailments. This sort of thing really happens in medicine. There's a famous case of the 11 blue men who turn up on the streets of lower Manhattan with blue extremities, blue lips, blue fingertips. Several of them die. Others are rushed to the hospital and manage to survive. But the question is, what caused it? Why do these people suddenly have blue? And I mean sky blue, not just a little bit bluish like a bruise. I mean sky blue extremities. What was going on? They ended up tracing it back to a particular diner where those people ate. And it turned out one of the salt shakers did not contain sodium chloride. It contained sodium nitrate, used in curing bacon, for example. And so it was really a case of nitrate poisoning. Anyway, it was, even then it was a bit of a puzzle. Lots of people sat at that table and used that as their salt shaker, and only a few got sick. So like, why did only that few get sick? The answer is they were all alcoholics who used lots of this stuff. In any event, when we think about that, it takes a lot of reasoning to get there. And you might say, yeah, that wasn't based on a feeling of expectation. That was based on reasoning. But Hume would say, remember my distinction between the complex and the simple. Sometimes in science, we have to take lots of relatively simple connections. And then, yes, use reasoning to get the complex. There's a huge amount of reasoning that goes on in that distinction between the simple and the complex. But if you trace it back to those simple inferences, they are all going to have this effect.